Is my sound better?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay, great. Thank you.
I just wait 30 seconds because it seems that participants are still coming in, and then we will start. Please feel free to say hello in the chat as well. So I think we are starting, and good morning, good afternoon, good evening for everyone who is attending this webinar. My name is Esther Kishmodi. I'm the Chief Executive of SRHM, Sexual and Reproductive Health Matters. That is an organization that is deeply rooted and hearted in and centered with the SRHM, earlier RHM Journal. And we are, on behalf of SRHM, I'm really very warmly welcoming you. The topic of this webinar is about the funding of the SRHR movement. And this discussion that we have initiated has started with Amplified Change, and I'm very thankful for the partnership, and Alex is here representing Amplified Change and the partners, about how to hold the discussion about the changing funding environment around sexual and reproductive health and rights issues, in the context how movement and advocacy is changing, and how politics is changing around sexual and reproductive health and rights, both at the local, regional, and global geopolitical context. We have started a conversation. So this past 18 months was really bringing together and acknowledging the already existing conversations, research, knowledge spaces, opinion exchanges that exist. It was more a kind of organizing more discussions around it. We had several separate discussions, and we initiated the journal issue so we can recognize the ongoing knowledge exchanges that is happening in this area with different authors in different spaces, with different activists, with different connections of movements, and how all of these interconnected. So I'm handing over the chairing of this webinar to Sundari Ravindran, who is the co-founder of Reproductive Health Matters, and currently the co-founder editor of Reproductive Health Matters, and currently a senior editor and the editor of this special issue of the journal. Over to you, Sundari. And I also would like to acknowledge the spaces where all of us, including the panelists are. The panelists are located in India, South Africa, England, the US, Switzerland / French. And I also see many, many colleagues from around the world. Thank you so much for your availability and attention to this webinar and discussion. Over to you, Sundari.
Thank you, Esther. Hello, everyone. Delighted to welcome you to this webinar on donor funding for Sexual and Reproductive Health and Rights Advocacy, showcasing highlights from some of the papers included in an SRHM special issue on the same theme. We all know that while there has been progress in many aspects of sexual and reproductive rights, especially since ICPD, the path has been checkered, beset with crises, followed by some hard-won successes. And SRHM's special theme issue on donor funding for SRHR advocacy and movement building comes at a time when the need for a well-resourced SRHR movement that is resilient and fights back to regain lost ground is very acutely felt. This special theme issue addresses some of the key challenges related to resourcing SRHR advocacy and movement building. You will hear from the authors of 4 of the papers featured in this issue, the topics ranging from challenges in resourcing, civil society organizations engaged in SRHR advocacy, and feminist funding models, to advances in monitoring and evaluation of advocacy, always posed as a major challenge by donors. Besides these, the special issue includes an interview with AVID on advocacy for resourcing feminist and women's rights movements, and a roundtable article based on a series of rich discussions held with stakeholders from the SRHR and allied movements, donors, researchers, and civil society organizations last year. This issue is still in the making and will be available online in a couple of months. I'm now going to walk you through the structure of the webinar. We will start with highlights from their papers shared by 4 authors, and this will be followed by a couple of questions that I will be posing to these authors. We will then have a discussion based on selected questions that we welcome you, the participants in this webinar, to post in the chat box. And for purposes of access, you can, you can enable the show captions, and the caption function will be working. I also want to say that unfortunately today, one of the 5 speakers that we had originally invited could not join because of a mishap in her family, and she sends her apologies. Our thoughts are with her today, and we hope everything goes well for her. Now, over to the actual speakers. So we are going to start with Alex Lemay from Amplify Change, who will be sharing highlights from his paper on is there an alternative to grant funding for sexual and reproductive health advocacy, based on a survey of the income base of Amplify Change grantees. Alex Lemay has been with Amplify Change for 9 years, in which time the fund has awarded 1225 grants and received over 10,000 proposals from local civil society, mostly in Africa and South Asia. He's currently head of learning, innovation, and partnership, developing learning communities across Amplify Change's grantee partners and supporting local civil society organizations to get recognition for their impact and expertise. Over to you, Alex. Look forward to hearing from you.
Thank you very much, Sundari, and thank you very much, Esther. And it's lovely to see so many people coming along for this webinar today. I'm not too surprised, because funding and financing is a very, very important issue. Advocacy needs funding. We spend our time and we bring our skills and we create networks, or bring our networks to the task of changing policies or influencing others politically, for the sakes of sexual and reproductive health rights. But ultimately, money plays a substantial role in having that time, in creating strong and solid organizations and developing campaigns that can influence and can connect and mobilize a wider movement for sexual reproductive health rights. Now, we know that grant funding from donor governments and philanthropic wealth plays a critical role. Grants are prized and highly sought after. Now, getting data on the flows, particularly the international flows of funding for sexual reproductive health rights, let alone advocacy for sexual reproductive health rights, is not actually that easy. So if you look at the data that's out there, say the OECD does some good work in terms of trying to collect together, and different civil society organizations have had various monitoring initiatives. We often find it's quite difficult to really tease out what's for sexual reproductive health rights, as opposed to, for example, what can be categorized population and family planning, or for civil society engagement. Of course, this field is full of transparency questions and transparency issues. Many of those are quite well thought after. We work in a competitive environment, there's no question. But altogether, it makes it quite hard to get a simple grasp on the funding flows. But what we do know is that the allocation of funding between different civil society organizations, for example, is quite uneven. And it's hard not to call it disproportionate. Low middle income countries based civil society organizations receive a much lower share of funding than rich country-based organizations or international NGOs. By some measures, through a series of surveys that were pulled together in the 2000s, looking particularly at government funding or government grants for sexual reproductive health rights, we're looking at potentially something in the order of $1 in $20 going to local low middle income based organizations, and the rest going to rich country based organizations or international NGOs. The general scenario for funding is undoubtedly looking stressed. Some key government funders have experienced really significant political challenges. They may have weathered the financial crisis of the sort of from 2008 through the 2010s. But the experience of COVID, and particularly the war in Ukraine, has caused something of a rupture in the consensus, or at least the momentum towards 0.7% GDP being spent on international development. So I read the other day that at the moment, the UK government is now spending on cruise missiles, tanks, social and economic support to Ukraine, 0.2% of its GDP. At the same time, we've seen similar sorts of falls in international development spending. And we also see climate change has become very much the dominant cause in progressive circles, where I remember about 20 years ago, making poverty history was probably the dominant cause amongst my fellow students when I was at university. Inflation and aging populations are eating into the fiscal space of governments. There's no question about it. So there's clearly a need right now, and I think it's fantastic that Esther and Sundari have brought this panel together, and what contribution we can make towards redoubling our efforts to prioritize international financing to support sexual reproductive health rights around the world, but also, of course, to reimagine international development assistance. There's clearly an unfinished agenda in terms of the allocation of funding between different civil society organizations. But what we're also concerned about, and we wanted to investigate, and we've kind of written up in this article for this edition, is to what extent are civil society organizations diversifying their income? How much are they raising funding from alternative sources to grants? So where are they, what kinds of alternatives are they looking into and trying to use? And how much are they funding? How much are they generating from those different sources? Now, Amplify Change is a grant maker. We are not a research institution. What I'm not presenting is a very thought out sample. This is certainly nothing like that. It's not a sort of random sample of civil society organizations or what have you. Instead, we've kind of used the opportunities that we kind of have at our fingertips, I suppose, in Amplify Change. So what we did to set out these questions around alternatives to grants was to have a look at the base of the grantees the funding base of the grantees that we are supporting at Amplify Change. So back in 2020, we did a survey, and most of the grant portfolio of Amplify Change is small to medium-sized organisations with operating budgets under £200,000 or so, most based in sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia. And grants are selected through open and competitive calls for proposals that are received, that are reviewed largely by independent reviewers. So ultimately, we receive a very large body of organizations who can apply to Amplify Change, and that is kind of narrowed down to the selected applications. We're receiving roughly 10 times as many applications as grants awarded. At the moment, we're at about 1,225 grants. And we know that obviously these grants, through that process, that sort of creates a process in which some of the highest quality, most competent organizations kind of rise to the top. And they're mostly local and middle sized civil society organizations. So in 2020, we were at around about 349 grants active at the point at which we did the survey. So we reached out to them doing an online survey to see what the different sources of funding they were looking to finance their organizations and their work. We got a response of about 60%, so a pretty good response rate. And this is broadly what we found out. So I'll give you a very whistle-stop tour of that. But you can, of course, find out lots more when you see the articles published shortly. I'm hoping that people can see this okay. I will try and just switch to bigger. Is that coming through okay? Can somebody give me a wave? Lovely. Okay. So this graph here, which you can study at your leisure when the article is published, really tells the story. I think we found a pretty marginal amount of funding being raised from alternative sources to grants. Sexual reproductive health rights civil society advocates rely heavily on grants, and they actually rely heavily on international grants. More than 85% of funding was sourced from OECD DAC contributing countries, so basically wealthy countries. 10% was coming from local or national government, and philanthropic funding that was sourced from local philanthropists accounted for about 3% of funding for the organizations that we surveyed. And alternatives to grants, which could include all sorts of things from consultancy through to where we found some organizations using pig farming to support their income, accounted for only around about 1% of funding. Just to sort of lay that a little bit bare around three particularly difficult areas to raise funding for, or more marginalized topics: abortion rights, comprehensive sexuality education, LGBT+. This is obviously just our portfolio of grantees in 2020. You can see a very similar sort of picture. Extremely critical role that grants play in the finance base of these civil society organizations. And we, of course, we would find a higher level for Amplify Change because it was the grants that we are supporting, but it is notable how limited the options are for local civil society organizations. I think that's clearly improving, and we can maybe talk about that in the discussion. But what I would say for the time being is, if you're interested in learning a bit more about the organizations who have tried to seek alternative sources of funding, we've basically collected a number of what we call how-to guides. These are short kind of vignettes, short case studies from different organizations, local civil society organizations who have had some experience of trying to raise funding from different sources, membership dues, social enterprise, consultancy, and they've written up their experience and put them onto this website, Amplify Change Learn. So if you're interested, check it out. There's maybe the overall picture is that it's a limited amount, but there's obviously lots of opportunity for more. So take a look. Thanks very much.
Thank you. Thanks, Alex, for setting the ball rolling and showing, how precarious the situation of SRHR organizations, local organizations, is in terms of their dependency on international grant funding and the vagaries of it. And I now call upon Lisa Adams. Lisa will be talking on Forgotten by Donors, a call to action by persons with disabilities to resource disability justice within sexual and reproductive health rights funding. Lisa Adams is a disability and gender justice expert with over 20 years of directing disability justice programming, intersectional advocacy, and inclusive grant making internationally, working with governments, activists, social justice organizations, donors, UN agencies, and human rights institutions. A core part of her work has been engaging feminist activists with disabilities and their allies on sexual and reproductive health justice, cross-movement building, and intersectional research. Lisa, over to you, and we look forward to hearing from you about the challenges of this movement.
Thanks so much, Sundari, and thanks, Alex, as well for your presentation. So my name is Lisa Adams. Just a quick image description. So I'm a woman in my late 40s. I have white skin, brown hair, about shoulder length, a little bit wavy, messy, wearing glasses, and I have a big smile on my face because I'm very happy to be here having this discussion. There are not enough spaces for this, so thanks for the opportunity. I'm going to talk specifically about funding gaps at the intersection of SRHR and disability justice. And I'm going to go ahead and share my screen, so just bear with me for 1 sec. Okay, so can you all see my screen okay?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, great. So thank you, Alex, for the information about the data and how difficult it is to unpack data around SRHR funding. That's something that I examined in the paper, but in particular where funding for SRHR goes in terms of intersectional work, intersectional advocacy and movement building around disability justice, and it's very hard to find the information. But let me start by what I want to start with is before I share the data, is to just give a quick kind of framing for what some of the major issues are at the intersection of ableism and reproductive injustices.
Lisa, can you do a share screen?
Oh, sorry, I thought
Go
I had,
to your, yeah. Thank
okay.
you.
Okay,
Yeah.
I thought I was.
Oh,
1 sec, let me go back.
no, I mean, sorry, can you do the full screen? So I'm sorry, yeah.
Oh, yes, sorry.
Yeah.
Thought it was already.
Slideshow mode, I'm sorry.
Okay. There we go. Sorry about that. Okay. So, yes, so going back to the intersections of some of the major issues around disability justice and sexual and reproductive health rights. When these two, when ableism and reproductive injustices intersect, the issues that we're talking about are persons with disabilities not having control or choice over their sexuality or their reproduction. We're talking also about a lack of culturally competent and accessible sexual and reproductive health services and information. The denial of persons with disabilities as sexual beings on the one hand, and on the other hand, in many contexts, the hypersexualization of persons with disabilities and the impact that that has on sexual and reproductive health. The systemic widespread violence, including forced and coerced sterilizations, forced and coerced contraception, and abortion. And unfortunately, these issues are still largely absent from sort of what I want to say mainstream SRHR feminist spaces and conversations. And finally, another important issue to highlight is the removal of decision-making to consent and make informed decisions about one's body and one's life, especially with restriction of one's legal capacity or decision-making capacity recognized by law, whether it's through the courts being placed under guardianship or de facto denial of decision-making. So just to highlight some of the major issues on these at these intersections. And now looking at that in terms of funding and data on funding, what we find is first, it is hard to find the information, but also what we can find shows us that there's extremely little funding going to SRHR and disability. So if we look at funding from private foundations, so human rights grant making, philanthropy, we see that 3% of human rights grant making in 2019, based on research, went to disability. And then from the OECD countries, multilateral, bilateral donors, funding on disability was 4%. And this is largely going to low and middle income countries. Then if we want to look at more intersectional funding and try and understand how much funding is intersectional, from the data that does exist, both private foundations and multilateral, bilateral funding and donors is mostly siloed. So looking at one issue, one identity. So it's really not looking at addressing intersectional identities, cross-movement work, intersectional advocacy. So to put that in context, again, from existing data, it's mostly from 2019. 28% of human rights funding from private donors addressed more than one population. But only 7% of this funding actually looked at more than two groups. So for example, Indigenous peoples with disabilities from who identify as LGBTQI. So a very small amount is really looking at more layered and more nuanced intersections. And then when we look at SRHR funding specifically by private foundations, human rights grant making, only 3% addressed disability intersections. So what this paper presents is really the voices and perspectives of several disability justice activists that I interviewed, mostly from the Global South, to get their perspectives on what they see as critical in order to shift the needle and to influence funding to be more intersectional, and also what kind of barriers can be reduced in order to get access to this funding. So I'm going to try to highlight as best I can most of the recommendations, but it's, there's a lot more to unpack and read in the paper as well. But the first one being really eliminating barriers to funding. But what does that mean? Firsthand, it means getting actual access to donors and donor information and information about funding. And when groups that have been structurally excluded and disenfranchised don't have the social capital to access these networks, what can donors do, and what is their responsibility to make sure that they can have more information spread to these groups and open up spaces and mechanisms to get more access to the information about funding. And then what can donors also do to really look at their funding requirements and their application processes that may have access barriers to persons with disabilities? For example, for deaf persons that are applying, what can be done to enable oral sign language applications? What can be done to make sure that there aren't access barriers for persons that use screen readers to the actual application process themselves? How can the application processes be more flexible and be simplified to be more accessible? The second point that was highlighted by activists is what donors can do to make sure that they're supporting more critical reproductive justice issues for persons with disabilities. So issues that aren't often on the agenda are like decision-making and consent, such as supported decision-making for persons with disabilities, informed consent, looking at the issue of legal capacity, denial of legal capacity and decision-making by persons with disabilities, and how does that impact their access to sexual and reproductive health services. Also looking at things like making accessible sexual and reproductive health services accessible and inclusive, dismantling ableist stigma in accessing these services. And how can these be made at the community level to be more accessible? And that also includes comprehensive sexuality education, which is largely inaccessible to many persons with disabilities, especially those that are that are discriminated and excluded from education, mainstream education. And so in special education schools, in deaf schools, for example, comprehensive sexuality education is hardly available or accessible. So this is another priority issue. What can donors do to better embed disability justice into reproductive justice frameworks within their own grant making? So moving beyond looking at disability as a rights violation and vulnerability issue, but more comprehensive and intersectional look at how do the complexities of these intersecting oppressions impact persons with disabilities, and what more nuanced conversations can we have around that? Also looking at sex-positive conversations around persons with disabilities' right to intimacy and to sex, and what does that mean? So these are some of the more complex and nuanced conversations that are failing to be on the table. And finally, donors need to commit to more intersectional work broadly. And from a disability justice perspective, how can funding support more cross-movement advocacy between disability rights and sexual and reproductive health rights? How can donors support more capacity building on sexual and reproductive health rights and disability justice for both movements? And here, what I want to stress is that I think because movements are siloed and because funding has been siloed, the SRHR movement may not know a lot about the priorities of persons with disabilities. And on the other side, the disability movement, which is fairly male-led and patriarchal in structure, has sidelined SRHR within its own movement. So the importance of intentionally funding these spaces where more cross-movement conversations can take place is really important. And centering the leadership of the leadership and the wisdom of persons with disabilities and investing in that is also extremely important. And I will leave this with a quote by one of the women that I interviewed, Rabina Alambuya from Triumph, Uganda. It's an organization of persons with psychosocial disabilities. If you don't understand the lived realities of structurally excluded groups of persons with disabilities, you can't effectively create programs and design programs. And so this is where I think donors can do a lot more to make some transformative changes to be able to have these conversations and to better inform their programming. And I think my final statement will be for donors to also look internally at their own organizations. And are they hiring persons with disabilities? And I think that can be another really powerful shift in the narrative as well. So The final slide I have is just gratitude to the interviewees who shared with me all of their wisdom. So Dwi Aryani from Indonesia, the Disability Rights Fund, Rabina Alambuya from Triumph Uganda, Phyllis Mbeke Nodolo from Women's Spaces Africa in Kenya, Simone Aspis from Changing Perspectives UK, and Agnes Chindimba from Deaf Women Included in Zimbabwe. Thank you all.
Thank you, Lisa, for bringing us face to face with the stark reality of the cross-sectional, intersectional space that not enough people pay attention to. And for everyone, read more in Lisa's article when the issue comes out. Thanks. We now move on to a more positive, I hope, picture where Sanjana again will share her experiences with Women's Fund Asia on shifting paradigms through feminist funding. Sanjana is the Director for Advocacy and Strategic Partnerships at Women's Fund Asia. She leads the fund's work on advocacy for increased and improved resources for feminist movements in Asia. In her work on gender, sexuality, and bodily autonomy, she has worked on integrating creative methodologies like sports, films, theater to advance SRHR of all people. Sanjana is currently based in Goa, India. She said she is now speaking from Delhi, if I'm not mistaken. Over to you, Sanjana.
Yes, thank you, Sundari. I hope everyone can hear me. Yeah, great. Thank you so much. Hi, everyone, and thank you for joining. I'm looking at the number of participants. It was a little intimidating. There are 121 participants, but thank you so much for taking out the time for this conversation. Thank you, Alex and Lisa, for those excellent insights. I think it has made a bit of my work easier because I also had similar information to share. So without taking further ado, I'll begin. So I work with Women's Fund Asia, and our paper focuses on the work that we do as a feminist fund in Asia, in the funding ecosystem. I think I want to start with first really talking about who women's funds and feminist funds are. How do we describe ourselves, and what is our identity or role in the larger ecosystem, in the larger funding ecosystem? So women's funds actually are very uniquely positioned in the funding ecosystem, actually, because we do see ourselves as the resourcing arm of the feminist movements. We do see our role as a very, very political role, and we do not see ourselves as intermediaries where the work is not transactional. It is not about fundraising and then kind of, passing the resources to grassroots movements. Many times, and I say that because many times our role is misunderstood or is simplified to see it as simple as intermediaries. But it's really important for us to constantly challenge that framing and really claim a more political role that we play in the funding ecosystem. We see ourselves as builders of a feminist resource architecture in this funding ecosystem, where we are constantly where our feminist grant making, our movement-led approach, and our constant endeavor to keep innovating with different resourcing models is really at the heart of the work we do. And I say this because right now we are working in a context which is extremely hostile, extremely challenging, especially for grassroots groups on the ground, for feminist groups on the ground, where receiving money and flowing money and resources in the hands of activists who are really at the front lines of the movement, it has become extremely difficult. And this is particularly, this is something which is it's a very hostile environment, especially in Asia, and therefore our role has become even more critical and urgent in this ecosystem, and therefore for us to constantly innovate and explore alternative resourcing models has become absolutely urgent and immediate. Why? And so the next part that I want to really focus on is the resource landscape. Both Alex and Lisa have talked about it, but also to really kind of look at why are women's funds and feminist funds really critical in this resource landscape. As we have seen, funding for gender equality continues to decrease, right? It has decreased. We are seeing budget cuts in development aid, in a lot of aid from the bilaterals, from the multilaterals. If we look at the OECD data from 2016 to 2017, we know that only 1% of all gender-focused aid actually went to women rights organizations. And when we further look into that, the women rights organizations that we're talking about are also mostly organizations that are either INGOs or organizations that are not always necessarily led by women and girls themselves. So how do we also continue? We do continue to see that a lot of the aid and the resources that might be available on women rights organizations are actually not for locally led groups and community-based groups, might be for organizations and are for organizations that are sometimes based in the same countries and in the global north. Furthermore, Asia continues to be hugely deprioritized when we talk about resourcing for gender equality. And actually, if we move on, in 2021, when we look at the Generation Equality Forum, we all know that about 40 billion USD was committed for gender equality. But when we actually look at that data, when we actually look at what it meant, it was only 5% of that data that was meant to support feminist movements and women rights organizations. Furthermore, in 2023, today's context, more and more resources are going for anti-rights work and anti-gender work, and we all know that. And one of the first things to be impacted by that are bodies of women, bodies of girls, bodies of trans, intersex, lesbian, bisexual, and queer people. A huge attack on women's freedoms and agencies, reproductive choices and freedoms, a huge attack on abortion rights. We are seeing budget cuts, which will impact a lot of feminist movement building, mobilizing around these issues at the grassroots level. So, and we are looking at broader bilateral, multilateral data. If you look at the philanthropy data as well, a recent report by Britspan and Shake the Table did say, I think lighting the way, it did say that in 2017, that less than 1% of the foundation funding or giving foundation given was directed towards women rights organizations. And despite that very little amount of money that has gone to feminist movements or women rights organizations, most of the work, actually the report states that a lot of the work that has happened during times of crisis has been led by feminist movements on the ground, despite the limited investment or resources that was available to them. I think the reason why we need to really constantly challenge this data or work within the parameters of this data is because that's exactly what the role of a women's fund is, to constantly challenge where resource flows are going. Our resource justice advocacy agenda is very clear in challenging the way resources are thought about, resources are allocated, funding practices are implemented, and to constantly really center people on the margins when we think of allocation of resources. This informs our advocacy agenda in a very critical way. And therefore, our agenda is to constantly raise more flexible resources for movements on the ground. Flexible, which the groups can decide themselves on how to use them, unrestricted resources, core resources, as well as long-term sustainable resources. We all know, we all know that bringing about systemic change and structural change, to work on issues of bodily autonomy and agency, and to really build a culture of consent, it requires time. We work to challenge frameworks, monitoring, evaluation, and learning frameworks that are always trying to see how much cost benefit analysis can come out of a certain intervention, how much cost per girl is actually effective in saying that this intervention was effective. So how do you challenge these value for money approaches, which the donors constantly continue to kind of push on feminist groups and organizations? I think for us, what is also really, really important is, I think, building on to what Lisa was saying, that intersectionality is really at the heart of the work that we do through our feminist grant making. Very, very strong commitment to knowing that all of us live lives which are impacted by multiple identities with multiple issues and multiple marginalizations. So addressing issues in silos is something that is not uh, is not the approach that we support. We are very, very clear that our grant making is for feminist groups on the ground that are led by women, girls, trans, and intersex people. Therefore, really kind of ensuring that it's not just representation, but really the leadership of these groups that matters. In terms of how do we do it, like I said, feminist grant making is really the core mandate of the work that we do, where we support feminist intersectional movements, diverse strategies that are used by different groups at multiple levels, groups that are working at the intersections of SRHR and climate, groups that are working at the intersections of SRHR and livelihoods, education, gender, etc., young indigenous feminist groups working on environmental justice, trans groups working on labor rights, sex worker groups working on migrant rights. So how do we ensure that funding and resources are really available to them? And they are and they have the ability to be able to decide what to use it for. We do, as part of our feminist grant making work, we do recognize and resource the labor of feminist activists, really challenge the framework that as activists, salaries can be compromised. We, as part of our budgets, one of the core things as part of our budgets is to really ensure that all feminist groups or all groups that apply to us are able, or are our grantee partners, are able to really allocate resources for their institutional strengthening, for their institutional work, for the care and well-being of their staff, as well as for salaries of their staff. So really challenging the framework that feminist activism is unpaid labor, or is something that doesn't need to be resourced. How do we continue to really fund and resource and support the activists who are at the forefront of the work that they're doing? The work that we do, our grant making allows us to really kind of also support groups that are working towards long-term structural change. This is a tough one because unless and until we have a pipeline ensured of resources, we have the money committed to us, we are unable to make those commitments. But our commitment is to ensure we are able to give multi-year grants, we are able to renew grants with the same partners, and we are really able to kind of support partners in a long-term way. And also support partners and organizations that are committed to building a more feminist analysis of these issues. So feminist perspective building at the grassroots level, feminist movement building, mobilizing work, collectivizing work is absolutely key to the kind of interventions we support, where women, girls, trans, and intersex persons are recognized as right holders and not just receivers of services. I think the last piece that I really want to talk about is the way we this is the feminist grant making side of it, but also really how do we reflect this and practically bring it back into the advocacy that we do with the donors, with the funders, with the bilaterals, and the other allies in the ecosystem. I think for us, what is really important is to also challenge the fact, also to recognize the fact that the resource landscape is really shaped by colonization and years and systems and systemic oppression, right? So how do we also continue to decolonize the way funding is done? So how do we continue to challenge narratives? How do we continue to change funding politics and practice, and challenge the way funding is thought of in silos? A lot of our work with the bilaterals really focuses on saying that women's rights work cannot only sit in your gender equality portfolio. The climate change portfolio is equally important for us to also interact with. And how do we really bring that intersection across different funding portfolios within philanthropies, within foundations, within governments? We do think money is very political. When we say resources, we are very clear we're talking about money. We are not talking about non-financial resources. Money is very political, and therefore the claim to money is very political. And we talk about really bringing the money in the hands of people who are at the forefront of feminist movements, making funding very accessible, to groups on the ground, and also making funding as restricted as possible. A lot of the funding that comes with restrictions around geographies, comes around restrictions with thematics, etc. How do you keep engaging with the donors to continue to challenge that? And I think the last piece that I want to add to this is that our funding is also, our advocacy is also to bring in resources, to mobilize resources that are long-term and that are sustainable. Today, as of today, we have a grant making budget of over 6.5 million, and that is only addressing 30% of the ask that we get. 60 to 65% of the applications that we get continue to go unmet. Therefore, how do we continue to bridge this gap? How do you continue to bring resources that are long-term, that are sustainable? And also be able to provide resources in a non-competitive way. Right now, we are putting out an open call for applications. Ideally, the dream is to be able to support every single feminist group that applies to us for a grant. And I think that is really where we are at the moment in terms of our vision as a feminist fund, as a women's fund. And we do this in collaboration, in a collective with a lot of other women's funds, with the International Network of Women's Funds, the Prospera Network. The more women's funds, there's a lot of collective advocacy with funders, with other actors in the ecosystem. And therefore, to be able to really bring about, really shift the way funding is thought of is about, we are constantly thinking, do we scale or do we deepen? Do we continue to provide as more grants, or do we stick with a smaller number of grants and go deeper? I think these are questions that we don't have answers to, but we do continue, we commit to really kind of ensuring that we are constantly faced with these questions, where we are able to talk about more resourcing, where we are able to challenge the way funding is accessed and is available for groups on the ground. And I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Sanjana. I think you have put out there an alternative model for how donors can be, and including all the challenges facing that. And I'm sure there will be questions about, how much can the SRHR field, the donor field learn from the experiences of women's funds. And now to our last speaker in this panel, Barbara Klugman. Barbara is going to be talking about, monitoring and evaluation challenges in advocacy. And it's very interesting that she wrote a paper for Reproductive Health Matters in 2011 on effective social justice advocacy, a theory of change framework for assessing progress. And recently, when I was talking to her about this special theme issue, we hit on the idea that we could revisit, we could republish her paper, which is still very relevant. And she very kindly agreed to update it with reflections on the terrain since 2011, which is quite a decade ago. So Barbara is a South African freelance strategy and evaluation practitioner. She was deeply involved in the advocacy that won several sexual and reproductive rights policies in South Africa, as well as the definitions of reproductive rights and health and sexual rights at the Cairo and Beijing conferences. She worked for some years as the Ford Foundation's Sexuality and Reproductive Health International Program Officer. So here we have a speaker who has been on both sides of the table. Over to you, Barbara.
Thanks so much, Sundari. And I want to start actually, I'm in the wrong place, aren't I? Give me a moment. I'm somehow not where I want to be. That's where I want to be. Can you see this?
No.
Okay.
Are you sharing screen?
I will be.
We just saw you doing it.
Yeah. There we go.
Yeah.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
So I want to start by thanking Sexual and Reproductive Health Matters for giving me the chance to think about this, because it also marks the period in which I've been doing freelance work on this topic. And so it's very interesting to think about how things have and haven't moved, not so much in the area that my colleagues here have been speaking about, which is the money itself, but the terrain of evaluation and learning, and how both advocacy groups as well as funders are and aren't shifting their thinking around these kinds of issues. So, and I should also say, as you'll hear, that much of what I want to say resonates very closely with what the previous speakers have said. The previous paper offered the idea of a kind of theory of change that would allow people to unpack progress in the process of doing advocacy, because there was this idea that you couldn't really evaluate advocacy because policy change can happen at any time. It's unpredictable, many people are involved. And I tried to learn. I was frustrated with the lack of understanding about how to evaluate my own work when I was at the Ford Foundation. And so I did this research to look at what do we know about evaluating advocacy, and found that there was a good literature and really great ideas on how you could pick up progress and lack of progress along the way that could be useful for supporting our strategizing, whether as funders or as activists. And I applied it to a retrospective analysis of policy victories in the sexual and reproductive justice rights field in South Africa, and then losses that happened fairly soon after those victories, in order to kind of see how it would work. So I'm just going to fiddle with my screen for a minute. Okay. So this little reflection that I wrote notes quite big shifts in the thinking of many activist groups and advocacy groups from this kind of fear and thinking it's too complicated, it can't be done, towards recognizing that one can stop and look at to what extent things are going as hoped. What does this mean? How do we look at not just what we've done, but what we've achieved or haven't achieved in order to strengthen our strategizing? And this idea of emergent learning has become very current, which is really to say, rather than seeing monitoring and evaluation and learning as something that happens once a year for a funder, it's actually implicit and could be explicit in the way that activists and advocates do our work. Sorry, trying to move on without any luck. Another theme I think that's come up very strongly in that is that we're talking about our work, not work that evaluators do on us, whether us is the funder or us is the community group or advocacy group, but that actually if we're interested in evaluation for learning, then we're interested in participation. And I think that's been something that's grown enormously, both in the world of evaluation and in the world of advocacy groups, wanting to take ownership of this and stop monitoring and evaluation and learning being something deeply disempowering that's done for somebody else, and rather something that we do for ourselves. And so I think that's been a significant shift. And when I talk about shifts here, I'm not saying these shifts are happening with every funder or with every advocacy group, but I'm saying there's some trends that are quite noticeable. The other thing is that we're seeing a much greater use of outcomes-oriented evaluation approaches and attention to causal pathways. What do I mean by that? I mean much more focus on what changed and why, rather than on what we did. how many workshops we had. A much stronger focus on to what extent, what changes happened and what does that tell us? What can we learn from that? In the evaluation world, I've noticed innumerable calls for proposals for evaluators that talk about an outcome focus. They talk about the use of outcome harvesting. They talk about contribution analysis, which is a really interesting way to say, well, we know that big advocacy victories and even smaller victories along the way, or losses for that matter, but here talking about victories, are often influenced by many different players. And so contribution analysis allows people to look and say, well, what was our role? What was the role of that group? What was the role of this group? What does that tell us about our strategies? And what does that mean going forward? And so I think that's also been a very noticeable change. The other thing which I'm particularly interested in is that if we're talking about advocacy for rights, advocacy for justice, then how we do that advocacy, frankly, matters as much as whether we achieve the things we're trying to win. And feminist movement, sexual and reproductive health movement are very concerned, as some of our speakers before have just been talking about, with the question of the how, the question of ethics, the question of equity, the question of inclusiveness. And what's been very interesting in this period is that you've seen a lot more elaboration of, for example, what does equity-focused evaluation look like? What does feminist evaluation look like? And a recognition that they're not always easy, that often the time required, the money required, the resources required don't make it that easy to do things in the way that you want them to do, but that it's terribly important. And on top of that, important for many groups to not just ask, as I say, did we achieve X, but to ask, for example, how do our partners experience us? How well do we work with our allies? And so you've seen the growth of this field called principles-focused evaluation, and some very nice guidance that can be enormously helpful to groups, whether from community groups to funders, in thinking about this and adding the question of principles to their evaluations. The other thing which a number of speakers have spoken about is we've seen a huge burgeoning of an interest in community level and grassroots funding. I'm sort of putting it under the banner of the Shift the Power movement, which is my bias because I'm on the board of the Global Fund for Community Foundations that helped catalyze that work. But it is really trying to support funders as well as local groups in getting to grips with the idea of trust-based philanthropy, the fostering of local resourcing, exactly what Alex has been talking about. What does it take for people to generate local resources and not be utterly dependent on the outside? And if they are dependent on money from elsewhere, what does it take for groups to feel in control over what money they take or don't take, or how they speak to funders and how they utilize their own power? And I've got a quote here from Indonesia for Humanity, Kamala, who talks about their approach to evaluation, which is very much about it serving as a collective space for shared learning that engages in a relational approach based on trust and mindfulness, rather than as a funder being kind of top-down and demanding. And so with many groups, we're seeing either an actual or a desire and a testing of moving away from preset indicators and a focus on what groups did, that in monitoring and evaluation they describe as outputs, or the relentless request for what I think of as guesstimates of influence, numbers of beneficiaries, towards rather trying to learn from what changes groups alone or with others have actually influenced or not been able to influence, and why this is. And also across the board recognition that core funding, the point Sanjana made, that core funding enables institutionalization of emergent learning processes. that the space for learning, the time for learning, and by learning, I'm including listening, gathering stories, talking with the people that you're funding, or if you're in your own organization, talking with constituents is part of the work. And the recognition that that evaluation piece is essential for effective strategies, rather than some other thing which shouldn't be funded and should be done in people's own time somehow. So those are the highlights, really. There are some other things in the reflection, but I've really enjoyed thinking about it, and thank you very much.
Thank you, Barbara. That was a huge learning experience for me, and I'm sure for many of the participants, and more when you see the published issue. As Barbara said, she has only highlighted a few of the emerging ideas in terms of how advocacy can be evaluated. So thank you to all the speakers. This has been, you've covered a broad range of issues. And Jessica, do you see any specific questions from the audience? If not, I think I am going to set the ball rolling, asking the panelists, you're coming from, both the donor community and the civil society space. What can donors do to better support SRHR advocacy and movement building, especially advocacy and movement building led by local organizations and organizations representing structurally excluded groups? So what are some ideas that you have based on your own experience, on ABC, some very concrete suggestions, asks of donors, or possibilities based on your experience as a donor? Over to you. Who wants to go? Yep.
I can say from
Sure.
donor perspective, it's Lisa speaking, obviously around disability resourcing. I think one of the first things that can be really helpful is for donors to publicize their commitment to working with structurally excluded groups, letting them know that they want applications from them, and sort of making that commitment more public as a first step.
Thank you. Anyone else? Yeah, Sanjana, sorry. Yeah.
Yeah. I think we all spoke about the commitment to intersectionality. I think that's really very important. But I think in addition to that, also to say that supporting frameworks, when we on the work on SRHR, supporting frameworks that are not protectionist, but really kind of center rights, are more rights-based and rights affirming. As well as I think it's important. I think two more things that I'd like to talk about is, one is also kind of in supporting work that talks about pleasure, that talks about joy, and is not only looking at work which is around violence and around, but something that kind of also really supports the work, innovation and exploration, and as well as experimentation, as well as really pleasure and joy. And the third piece, I think, is around having a bigger risk appetite. As donors, I think donors do shy away from taking that risk in terms of really seeing that how, and I think what Barbara was talking about, that even within our learning approaches, within our learning models, how do we really think about resistance or backlash or an intervention that does not work the way we wanted it to work? It works differently from the way we wanted to. So how do you also push donors to have a broader and a bigger risk appetite? And the fourth piece, I think, is also really recognizing that in today's context, crises have unfortunately become inevitable and a lot more frequent. And therefore, giving that flexibility to groups to be able to adapt, to be able to modify, to be able to adjust their budgets, their programming, their work is absolutely critical. And, and also really understanding that crises really impact the people on the margins the most. They are hit the hardest. Just resourcing for survival is not enough. We need to resource communities to thrive as well, to grow, and to really kind of come out of the reversal of gains that has happened during these times of crisis. So it's absolutely critical for all donors, I feel, to really see the broader landscape within which activists are working at the moment. Yeah.
Okay. Alex? Thank you, Sanjana. Very
Thank you.
concrete. Yeah.
Thank you. I think the points have all been made broadly about donors, and I think we sort of shared various ratios and numbers, like 10-to-1 applications to grants or 3-to-1 applications to grants. We've talked about trying to provide long-run funding, for example, which, if the pot doesn't get bigger, means less organizations get funding, by the way. But what we have to be careful of not being mistaken about, I think, with this whole edition, this whole issue, is training our advocacy resources at this kind of idea of a donor. This sort of simple idea of a donor. What is a donor? A donor is potentially somebody who's working within a government, who has a ton of different policies, regulations, practices, etc., they have to worry about. Ministers who they have to try and get this prioritized with. A broader media and social environment which may well not be very favorable towards what we're talking about. Or it may be that it's a philanthropic organization with, again, competition over what the prioritized subject is. Or if you're lucky to find a very, very wealthy person who happens to pick on this particular topic, then we go for it. But I think the point is, we need to be super careful with the boundaries that we sort of set ourselves in terms of what we're advocating towards, because donors of all shapes and sizes operate in a much wider political and social norm prioritization problem, So I think it's an interesting question for us all, really. And I'm not talking about our organizations, but maybe just I'm talking to each other as individuals here, and people who ourselves would consider ourselves to be active and activist for these topics, who care about, have fire in our bellies for abortion rights, for LGBT rights, or whatever it may be. That perhaps we try to broaden our horizons and broaden our understanding of donors, just as we're thinking about broadening our horizon and our focus on what civil society is or which organizations are marginalized. I think we also need to think about how can we support those donors to create environments in which they can allocate more funding, and they can allocate more funding to different kinds of civil society organizations than the ones that may be recognized by their voters on the high street.
Barbara?
Thanks. I want to pick up on what Alex just said, actually, because the last 3 years I've had the privilege of being involved in a really interesting experiment of the UK charity Comic Relief, which is a fairly traditional funder in terms of the kinds of issues we've been talking about, but they decided to do an experiment in women's rights funding, rather than saying overnight, okay, we're going to change everything we do and how we do it. They did an experiment in providing core funding and in inviting people to report in the ways that they felt were appropriate. They held consultations about their annual reporting form and changed it. And then very actively walked along with the groups that they'd funded to sort of see what happened. And I think that it's worth thinking about, precisely because of the bigger environment and the difficulties and the accountability to their publics in the idea of experimenting and explicitly creating a learning process, which is what they did, in order to see what works, what doesn't work, and why is that. So I wanted to just mention that as an example of a funder, as Sanjana said, being willing to risk, but doing it in a focused, intentional way. But the other thing I think is really important is that a lot of the talk about funding is about grassroots funding, and a lot of the women's funding is to try to get money to the grassroots. And I think there are two things we have to be careful not to leave out. The one is that big funders can't give away small bits of money. Therefore, they have to have intermediaries. And the question of the role and power of intermediaries and the dominance in that intermediary world, if I come to the case study that I wrote in my 2011 paper for South Africa, when I was drafting the paper I've just written, I spoke to quite a number of sexual and reproductive justice advocates here in South Africa, and they confirmed that the situation remains that most of the money coming into the country is coming in not just through international intermediaries, but to international NGOs. And so I think that there's a really big thing about the need for more global South intermediaries, and that even while we have a strong push for money to go to communities, movements and changing the world is not done by individual communities by themselves. There are a whole lot of other groups that make up, if you like, the ecology of a sexual and reproductive justice movement, which also need money. Everything from public interest law groups to networks, to groups that can either do research or support community groups to do research. And so there's an ecology, for want of a better term, that needs funding. And I think one mustn't sort of forget about that, from local all the way through to global. Thanks, Sundri.
Thank you. So now you have, quite a broad range of answers. And there are some very interesting questions coming up from the audience. And one of that question has been seconded by a few others as well, is from Amanda. And she says, in many ways, donors have abandoned funding SRHR advocacy in the broader shift to gender-focused funding. And how can we increase local government funding for SRHR issues, or how can we diversify the funding streams? This is precisely the question that Alex started off with, about what are the alternative sources of funding. So that's a question being reposed. And I think, Alex, if you would like to respond, and maybe the others as well, but to the challenges, because your data showed, less than 1% coming from social enterprises and minuscule coming from membership fees and so on and so forth. So yes, there is a need to diversify. How can we get more money from local governments or from other means? So if you would start off, and then there's a question for Barbara also. Yeah. Over to you.
Yeah, it's the extent of our paper was really to explore alternatives that organizations were using, and we were kind of shocked, actually. We obviously know, I mean, everybody in this room, I'm sure, will know that grants and that gifts are the major source of funding for a lot of civil society activity. But I think we were quite surprised that it was that level amongst the cohort that we looked at least. And quite surprised at how little overall alternative sources were. And I suppose if you think about perhaps maybe the opposition, or at least some of the more conservative forces that we may be having a dialogue with in our world, that in all settings, the church, religious organizations are able to raise money from all sorts of different communities, for example. and that money is, explicitly or in alliance, I suppose, with interests that we're in, let's call it dialogue or potentially in competition with. So there's a potential everywhere, and I think we've obviously seen with the organisations that we've identified, and we try to document their cases, that a lot of organisations are trying different things. Of course, that's about as much as I can really say in terms of advice or tactics myself, and from the position that I am in, because each of these different income streams requires a certain specialism and experience and innovation, risk-taking, and so on and so forth. Do donors potentially have a role in perhaps providing their funding that the donors have as something of a startup capital or experimentation for organizations who are looking to try and find alternatives? I'll leave that question hanging. And I think it was always very interesting if organizations approach us, for example, or I'm sure the same for Sanjana and other people who are managing funding. It's always very interesting to see organizations bring those sorts of ideas. Because there's potential that needs to be explored. In terms of government, I can't go too far with that question. We are at, we're in the sort of the business of advocacy. I think there's a whole debate and discussion about whether it's feasible, possible at all for a government to fund civil society to potentially critique it,
Challenge it.
I think there are cases around the world where governments do have relationships with civil society organizations that are somewhat safeguarded and that they can speak freely. But I think that's clearly a limitation. It takes a lot to set that up. I think that's about all I can say on that so far. But it's a question outstanding, and it's something that we need to document. It's something that we need to learn from everybody out there and raise those best cases about how, especially organizations that are not selling a service, how they can raise funding that can contribute to advocacy.
Yeah, there's some great ideas put up in the chat box about, cooperatives, cooperative fundraising, and so on, which will be an important takeaway for us. Barbara, there's one question, and I will stop with that and hand over to Esther. One question for you, which says, most of the development partners or donors may not understand the need for SRHR among persons with disability. How can we unpack these in the M&E perspective?
Thanks, Luke. It's a question of whose M&E perspective. So let me give this a bash. The first thing that comes to mind is the point that Lisa somewhat made, which is the huge proportion of people who are living with disabilities. So if a fund is trying to fund the population, that population includes a huge proportion of people living with disabilities. And so there's something about needing to just make that clear. If M&E means evaluating funders, then I think the thing to do is to look at funders' own commitments. Usually the kinds of funders we're talking about will have some kind of commitment. It'll be about exclusion, or it'll be about addressing poverty, or it'll be about addressing public health. And you can use those to evaluate how well the funder practiced their principles in terms of looking at, well, who are the poor, who are the people with public health crises, and so on. For an advocacy group, probably it would be about trying to gather what data you can to show the proportions of service users, for example, who are living with disabilities, and to surface the implications of that, or to following Lisa's point, put on the table what we know about how living with disability can increase people's, I don't want to say vulnerability, I'm not sure the right word, but to talk about stigma and discrimination in relation to sexual and reproductive rights. So I don't know if those are answering your question. I mean, usually the M&E is, if these are more strategy questions I'm putting forward. The M&E comes in and seeing how well you then manage to address that. But going back to my point about looking at principles in evaluation, if you put addressing disability or being disability inclusive as a principle in the work, then your evaluation will be asking at every point how that played out in everything from participation to, if it's service work, to services, if it's advocacy, then to voice and representation and so on. I don't know if that talks to your question. Thanks, Sundri.
Thank you, Barbara.
Sorry,
Yeah.
I was just going to add, I think also if the donors, partners don't understand the needs of persons with disabilities in relation to SRHR, then they should be working with them and contracting them as they design the program to begin with, as well as the M&E.
Thank you. And yeah, we're close to the closing time. So I'd like to thank all the speakers, all the participants for the very, very interesting chats in the chat box, sharing your knowledge, your ideas, and also asking very, very crucial questions. And thanks once again. Please look out for the special issue. It will be out in a couple of months, and you will get much more on each of these articles that you got a little taster of from the special theme issue. And with that, thanks again, and over to you, Esther.
Thank you so much. And on behalf of SRHM and all partners who were engaging in, or who have been engaging, because I feel that it's an ongoing conversation that that we have continued based on existing conversation. We are very much appreciative of being with us today. And I just wanted to acknowledge that the preparation of this, or holding this space and preparing this special issue, came in a very difficult time of SRHM's life. It was the past 2 years when we, in the past 30 years of existence of RHM and SRHM, we have started to experience significant crises in terms of funding and inability to raise funding, continue to raise funding because of the changing landscape, because of changing of priorities and many other issues. So actually we came to a conclusion to close SRHM until the end of, at the end of this year. And but we just couldn't believe that we have to do this move. And we put out the last call in June, many of you may be aware, when we thought that we feel that we did our best, or maybe we could have done more, but we could how much we did. And maybe there is an institution out there or a funder, or maybe there is some thinking that we missed along the way, and we put out a call for expression of funding, expression of taking over the SRHM Journal, that I have to report back to you that generated and totally unexpected movement around how to keep SRHM not only alive, but more repositioning SRHM to remain a thought leader and owed by the movement as it has been in the past 30 years as a journal, in a very unique space when we care about how we generate the knowledge and how we also influence impact, or in terms of changing inequalities in knowledge creation and changing the ecosystem of inequalities around knowledge generation. So we are very hopeful that as a result of all of these discussions, we actually don't have to close. And we are very hopeful that some of the the discussions that is not only about one funder stepping up, but actually funders talking about how the funders and partners movement should save and keep SRHM existing. So we are very hopeful now that it may happen in a very different way. So I feel that it from our own perspective, we talk about funding the SRHR advocacy and movement building, and we are actually experiencing what solidarity in the movement and thinking together may be capable to achieve. So when we're not only working in silos, but we are assessing that who is contributing in what way, how our existence is coexistence of an equilibrium of our movement, then maybe miracles can happen from this perspective. So I would like to close on a very positive note, thanking for the panelists, thanking for the participants, thanking for all of your solidarity on behalf of SRHM in the past couple of months. And I'm hoping that our conversations remain and we will be able to publish more thinking and research on this subject, and the discussions continues. Thank you very much. Have a nice continuum of the day, start of the day or closing the day. Bye-bye for everyone. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.